Mukam karoti vachalam Pangum langayate giram yat kripatamaham vande Shri Gurudharinam yat kripatamaham vande Paramananda Madhavam Shri Caitanya Ishwaram Katanchana Smrite Yasmin Dushkaram Sukaram Bhavet Vismrite Vipritam Syat Shri Caitanyam Namamitam. I know from where we stopped. It's at Calcutta, May 13, 1971. Okay, that's correct. Any volunteers to read today? Any volunteers to read?
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Yes, Leela Mai Mataji. Yes.
Yeah,
we haven't had you for a long time in reading. So yeah.
Yeah, we're kind of settling back in Bangalore.
Oh, okay. Just a sec. Okay, you can start. 1 minute.
Yes, Prabhu. Calcutta, May 13, 1971. Prabhupada arrived just in time for the 10-day Calcutta Pandal festival. On his orders, Giriraj and Tamal Krishna had come to organize the festival just as they had the one in Bombay. Prabhupada had written to Jayapataka Swami, president of ISKCON Calcutta. In the Sankirtan festival pandal, if a very big kitchen arrangement can be made, then we shall distribute prasadam daily. Try to make this arrangement. Puri, halwa, khichdi, okay, khichdi. Whatever can be arranged as much as possible. Tamal Krishna and Giriraj have all the ideas. Attendance surpassed that of the Bombay Pandal, with 20 to 30,000 people attending daily, including ministers of parliament and other distinguished speakers. It was one of the biggest religious functions Calcutta had ever seen. The whole city became aware of the strength of the Hare Krishna movement. In the early afternoon, the devotees would begin selling Srila Prabhupada's books from a booth, performing kirtan on stage, and distributing prasadam to the masses. Around 6:30, the evening program would begin with a long, intense kirtan, which would increase in its fervor as Prabhupada arrived for the evening aarti before the deities of Radha and Krishna. Prabhupada would lecture sometimes in Bengali and sometimes in English. Afterward, the devotees would show slides of the Krishna consciousness movement around the world, and Prabhupada would answer questions from the audience. After the program, people would push forward to receive a morsel of the prasadam that had been offered to the deity. Naxalite terrorists threatened Prabhupada's life. These young communist terrorists who had been active in Calcutta during Prabhupada's visit of 1970 had never disturbed him until now. Their tactic was to approach prominent businessmen in their homes or on the street and coerce them into cooperation with Naxalite political objectives. If a businessman refused, the Naxalites would burn his home or place of business or even assassinate him. The Naxalites, who were eager for all of Bengal to turn from their religious traditions and embrace communism, saw Prabhupada rekindling the religious spirit in Calcutta. Prabhupada's tremendous crowd gathering pandal, they concluded, was undermining the principles of communism. Fly or die, read the note Prabhupada received. He informed the police, who regretted their inability to help. The whole of Calcutta, they said, was in terror of the Naxalites. Prabhupada, however, refused to be intimidated. He would not fly. Even if they were to attack him, he said, what better way for a Vaishnava to leave his body than by preaching the glories of the Lord? The next night, as Prabhupada came before the crowd to speak, he noticed a group of rowdy young men, Naxalites, near the stage. They were protesting the preferential seating of certain dignitaries on stage. When one young radical shouted that the radicals themselves wanted to dance on stage, the devotees invited them to join in a kirtan. The Naxalites backed down but continued shouting and disrupting the meeting. They began banging the seats of the wooden folding chairs, calling out Naxalite slogans and threatening to burn the place down. Others in the audience began talking nervously among themselves, increasing the commotion. In a vain attempt to bring order, some of the devotees threatened the dissenters. Pushing and scuffling broke out in the audience. Chintamani prakara sadnasu kalpa vriksha laksha viteshu surabhira vipalayantam. Prabhupada's voice rang over the powerful loudspeaker system. Appearing uninterested in the crowd, depending only on Krishna, he began singing prayers from the Brahma Samhita, and within minutes, everyone quietened. Those who wanted to leave left, and those who wanted to stay sat down. The crowd subdued. Prabhupada lectured. Several more fly or die notes came, and the Naxalites returned the next night, threatening again to burn the pandal. Call them, Prabhupada said. I will meet with them. The devotees thought it unsafe, but Prabhupada insisted. In a small room behind the pandal, Prabhupada spoke with the hostile youths. They were angry and disrespectful at first. But as Prabhupada explained to them the Vedic concept of communism with Krishna at the center, he caught their interest. They agreed to allow Prabhupada's meetings to continue without any further disruptions. Achyutananda Swami. The last night of the 10-day Pandal program was a grand finale with over 40,000 people attending. I had just stepped out to get sugarcane juice. The Pandal was completely packed when I left. But when I got outside, I saw rivers of people flowing through the 4 main gates into the Pandal tent. I thought this must be Krishna's mystic power because the tent was already packed and still thousands of people were entering it. I thought that Krishna must be unlimitedly expanding the dimensions of space. The climax of the evening was a big procession beginning at the Pandal and going up to Park Street to the ISKCON temple on Albert Road. The deities of Radha Govinda rode on a palanquin to the temple where they were placed on the altar. After an aarti in the temple, the remaining crowd dispersed. Achyutananda Swami was standing next to Prabhupada that night in the Calcutta temple. Prabhupada, he said, someone put Krishna's flute in backward. Prabhupada looked. It was backward. Krishna is all powerful, he said, turning to Achyutananda Swami. He can play from the back end also. Srila Prabhupada was still striving for a plot of land in Mayapur, having abandoned the idea.
Can you just pause for a minute? Can you just pause for a minute?
Yes, sir.
A couple of things. One is that how this fly of dye poster came, and Prabhupada refused to back out. This is Prabhupada, that he said it's glorious to die like this. So Prabhupada always exhibited that spirit of fearlessness in the service of Krishna. So being followers of his divine grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, we should also imbibe that spirit of fearlessness. For Krishna's sake, we will do anything. That spirit. And another thing is that Prabhupada's conviction, Prabhupada always has displayed this conviction even while going to the West. That when he wrote in the Bhagavatam, that intelligent thinkers of intelligent and educated men and women of this world, if they take to the Bhagavatam, there'll be a revolution in the spiritual revolution in the world. Of course, those are not the exact words. I'm just paraphrasing on the introduction to the Bhagavatam. Here we see how Prabhupada actually believed it. He was not thinking that, okay, some people can be convinced, some cannot be convinced, and all those things. He believed that anybody who's sincere can be convinced. So here you can see he actually had a discussion with the Naxalites, and he convinced them that our kind of communism is the real kind of communism, spiritual communism, with Krishna as the center, Krishna as the owner of all the property, Krishna as the proprietor of everything. So Prabhupada actually convinced them. So this is a proof that Prabhupada meant what he said. He was not just talking some grandiose things. he knew that if people would listen to him attentively, they would be convinced. And finally, a last point about the flute. Who knows Krishna better than Prabhupada? So he said, yes, he can play the flute backwards also. Okay. Go ahead, Mat. Please go ahead, Mat.
Yes, Prabhu. Thank you. Srila Prabhupada was still striving for a plot of land in Mayapur. Having abandoned the idea that his god brothers in Mayapur might help, he had been working through Bengali friends in negotiating with Muslim farmers in Mayapur. On returning from Australia, Prabhupada had sent Tamal Krishna to Mayapur with orders not to come back until he had purchased land. Tamal Krishna's mission was successful, and after 6 days, he returned to Prabhupada in Calcutta, having purchased 9 bhigas, 3 acres in Mayapur. Conceiving the value of Mayapur was difficult for the devotees. However, one devotee journeyed from Calcutta to see the new ISKCON property and on returning asked Prabhupada, "What are we going to do there? It's just a big empty field. Nothing is there." "Because there are no factories and cars," Prabhupada replied, "therefore you think there is nothing to do. But we are going to chant Hare Krishna in Mayapur. We will build a big temple there, and all the devotees in the world can go out and chant Hare Krishna in the place of Lord Chaitanya's birth." On May 28th, Prabhupada wrote, "You will be glad to learn that we have purchased about 5 acres of land in Mayapur, the birth site of Lord Chaitanya, and we have proposed to hold a nice festival there from Janmashtami Day for 2 weeks. At that time, the foundation stone will be set down. I wish that all our leading disciples come to India at that time. There are 50 branches, so at least one from each branch should attend the function." June 1971. For months, Prabhupada had been planning to visit Moscow. Aside from his desire to preach to the Russian people, he had a specific meeting in mind with a Russian Indology professor, G.G. Kotovsky. Professor Kotovsky headed the Department of Indian and South Asian Studies at Moscow's USSR Academy of Sciences, and Prabhupada had been corresponding with him for a year. Krishnadasa in West Germany, with the help of Dr. Bernhard of the University of Hamburg, had obtained the names of other Russian scholars of Indology. A letter to Krishnadasa in December of 1970 had revealed Prabhupada's plans for preaching in Russia. "I am very encouraged to see your enthusiasm for preaching this message to the Russian people, and your idea to send letters with the help of Dr. Bernhard is very good. He is a big scholar and he also appreciates our movement. So, if you arrange a tour of Russia for me, I am prepared to accept. Let us see what Krishna desires. If we can go to Russia with our World Sankirtan party, I am certain that it will be very much appreciated and people will see the real peace movement is chanting process, chanting the holy names, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So try for it." Srila Prabhupada had coached Krishnadas on how to best cultivate the Russian Indologies. You can ask them some questions like, "What is the ultimate goal of life? What is your ideal ultimate goal of life? What is the difference between animal and human life? Why is religion accepted by all kinds of civilized societies? What is your conception of the original creation?" In this way, questions may be put to find out what is their standing. We do not grudge an atheist provided he has got some philosophical standing. In this way, try to elicit some answers from the professors. If you can finally establish one Moscow center, it will be a great credit to you. So far, studying Russian language, it is not necessary. But if you do so, it is all right. I want very much a center in Russia. So for the time being, I shall desire that Moscow center. In March 1971, Professor G.G. Kotovsky had replied to Krishnadas' letter. "I thank you for your information about Swami Bhaktivedanta's lecturing tour. If he would come to Moscow, the Soviet scholars doing research in ancient Indian culture would be very happy to meet him in the Institute of Oriental Studies, USSR Academy of Sciences. I would be thankful to you for your information on the dates of Swami Bhaktivedanta's arrival and stay in the USSR. Srila Prabhupada had personally replied to Professor Podofsky. It was understood that you and your university are interested in hearing about Krishna culture and philosophy. This ancient Krishna culture and philosophy is the oldest in the world or in the universe. At least from a historical point of view, it is not less than 5,000 years old. Perhaps you may know that I have started this cultural movement since 1966 and it is already spreading all over the world. Krishna culture is so popular in India that even the government attracts many foreigners by Air India timetable to visit Vrindavan, the land of Krishna culture. Enclosed, please find one page from the latest Air India timetable, April 1971, wherein the Krishna culture is depicted for general attraction. My life is dedicated to spreading this Krishna culture all over the world. I think if you give me a chance to speak about the great Krishna culture and philosophy in your country, you will very much appreciate this simple program with great profit. This culture is so well planned that it would be acceptable by any thoughtful man throughout the whole world. Having preached a year in the Eastern Hemisphere, Prabhupada was eager to return to the West, and he planned to fly to Moscow and on to Europe. For Prabhupada and his traveling companions, Shyam Sundar and Aravinda, getting tourist visas for Russia was simple. They would take a 5-day government controlled tour with every activity planned by the Soviet Tourist Bureau and everything paid for in advance. Captain Lal, the pilot of the flight to Moscow, considered Prabhupada an important passenger and came back to visit him during the flight. They spoke of Prabhupada's movement, his chances for return for lecturing in Moscow, and of Bombay, where Prabhupada was trying to purchase land. Captain Lal invited Prabhupada to the cockpit, and Prabhupada came and sat behind the captain, asking technical questions about the equipment and the flight. Prabhupada and Captain Lal agreed to meet again in Moscow. Prabhupada, his secretary, and his servant cleared Soviet customs and immigration quickly and smoothly, and a government tourist guide escorted them by limousine to the Hotel National. The hotel near Red Square, Lenin's tomb, and the Kremlin was expensive but plain. Prabhupada found his room dingy and cramped, with barely space for a bed and 2 chairs. The room for Shyam Sundar and Arvinda, was far away, and Prabhupada decided that Aravinda should share the room with him instead, crowding Prabhupada's room all the more. Aravinda told the hotel manager that they would not eat at the hotel, they would not eat the hotel fare, but would have to cook their own meals. The manager refused at first, but finally allowed them use of the maid's kitchen. That problem solved, the next was getting food. Prabhupada sent Shyam Sundar out. Across the street, Shyam Sundar found a milk and yogurt store, but he returned to Prabhupada's room without any fruit, vegetables, or rice. Prabhupada sent him out again, and this time Shyam Sundar was gone practically all day, returning with only a couple of cabbages. Prabhupada sent him out the next day for rice. When Shyam Sundar returned with rice after several hours, Prabhupada saw that it was a poor North Korean variety, very hard. Prabhupada asked for fruit, but Shyam Sundar had to hike for miles through the city to find anything fresh, a few red cherries. Prabhupada remained peaceful and regulated, keeping to his daily schedule. He would rise early and translate, and in the cool of early morning, he would go out for a walk through the all but deserted streets. Prabhupada, wearing a saffron chadar, strode quickly. Shyam Sundar sometimes ran, running ahead to photograph him. As they would pass Lenin's mausoleum, a queue would already be forming. Just see, Prabhupada commented one morning. That is their God. The people don't understand the difference between the body and the spirit. They accept the body as a real person. Prabhupada appreciated the sparseness of the traffic, some trolleys and bicycles, but mostly pedestrians. As he walked among the old ornate buildings, he saw elderly women hosing the wide streets. A good practice, he said. The Russian people appear to live structured, regulated lives much more so than the Americans. These simple, austere people, unspoiled by the rampant hedonism so common in America, were fertile for Krishna consciousness. But devoid of spiritual sustenance, they appeared morose. Prabhupada had Shamsundar arrange a meeting with Professor Kotovsky and invite Captain Lal to come along. The tourist bureau provided a car and guide, and Prabhupada and his party rode outside the city to Professor Kotovsky's office in an old white brick building at the Academy of Sciences. When Prabhupada arrived, the middle-aged Russian professor, dressed in a grey suit, got up from his cluttered desk and welcomed Prabhupada into his small office. Professor Kotovsky appeared a bit hesitant, however, more cautious than in his letters. When Shamsundar mentioned Prabhupada's eagerness to lecture before interested scholars at the academy, Professor Kotovsky flatly refused. It would never be allowed. Prabhupada was disappointed. The next moment, however, Prabhupada seemed unaffected and began speaking in his humble, genteel manner, sitting in a straight backed office chair beside Professor Kotovsky, who sat at his desk. Sham Sundar then turned on the tape recorder, which the professor eyed cautiously but didn't object to. Prabhupada, the other day I was reading in the newspaper Moscow News. There was a communist congress, and the president declared that we are ready to get others' experiences to improve. So I think the Vedic concept of socialism or communism will very much improve the idea of communism. Professor Kotovsky listened intently and politely as his foreign visitor explained how the grihastha in Vedic culture provides for everyone living in his house, even for the lizards, and how, before taking his meal, he calls in the road to invite any hungry person to come and eat. In this way, Prabhupada explained, there are so many good concepts about the socialist idea of communism. So I thought that these ideas might have been distributed to some of your thoughtful men. Therefore, I was anxious to speak. Professor Kotovsky's academic interest was piqued. You know, it is interesting, he said, his articulate English heavily accented. As it is here in our country, there is now great interest in the history of old thought. He described the accomplishments of his colleagues and himself, particularly a booklet they had recently prepared highlighting Soviet studies in Indology. He said he would like to give a copy to Prabhupada. Professor Kotovsky, you will be interested to discover that we published not all but some Puranas, then some parts of the Ramayana. 8 volumes in Russian of the Mahabharata and also a second edition of the Mahabharata translated by different people in full and published. Manusmriti is also translated in full and published with Sanskrit commentaries. And such was the great interest that all of these publications were sold in a week. They are now completely out of stock. It is impossible to get them in the book market after a month. Such a great interest among people here in Moscow and the USSR towards ancient Vedic culture. Prabhupada, among these Puranas, the Srimad Bhagavatam is called the Mahapurana. And he told of his own translation of Srimad Bhagavatam, the ripened fruit of the Vedic desire tree. He would show some volumes to the professor if he was interested. Professor Kotovsky said the Moscow and Leningrad libraries had nearly all the major texts of Indian culture in Sanskrit. These libraries house not only ancient texts but more recent literature as well, comprising an up to date study of Hinduism. Hinduism, Prabhupada interrupted, is a very complex topic, and they both laughed. Professor Kotovsky acknowledged that Hinduism was more than a religion, it was a way of life. But Prabhupada explained that the name Hindu was actually a misnomer. The real term to explain Vedic culture was Varnashrama. Briefly, Prabhupada described the four orders Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. Professor Kotovsky, you have told that in any society there are four divisions, but it is not so easy to distinguish. For instance, one can group together different social classes and professional groups into four divisions in any society. There is no difficulty. The only difficulty is, for instance, in socialist society, in our country and other socialist societies, how can you distinguish productive groups and workers? Prabhupada welcomed the professor's questions, although grounded in Soviet socialist vested interests. Prabhupada considered the professor not so much an academician as a pawn of the Soviet university system. Much as one political power tries to understand its adversary, the professor was inquiring into Indian culture so that his government might penetrate it with their own ideology. Behind Professor Kotovsky's apparent interest in Vedic culture, Prabhupada could see the view of the Communist Party, a view diametrically opposed to Vedic philosophy. Nevertheless, Prabhupada tactfully continued to present Krishna consciousness in accord with Parampara, and he tried to convince Professor Kotovsky through scripture and logic. Quoting Bhagavad Gita, a Shastra with which the professor was familiar in his own way, Prabhupada described Lord Krishna as the creator of the four divisions of society. Professor Kotovsky immediately countered with the theory of the Soviet scholars that the Varnashram divisions were a recent addition to Vedic culture. He also again registered his opinion that the divisions of Varnashram had no meaning within socialism. Professor Kotovsky, there is a great distinction between socialist society and all societies preceding socialism because in modern Western society, you can group all social sorry, there is a great distinction between socialist society and all societies preceding socialism because in modern Western society, you can group all social and professional classes in the particular class divisions Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, or factory owners, and Shudras, or menial workers. But here we have no Vaishyas because we have administrative staff in factories, managerial staff. You can call them Kshatriyas and then Shudras, the workers themselves, but not this intermediate class. Prabhupada, that is stated, Kalau Shudra Sambhavaha. In this age, practically all men are Shudras. That is stated. But if they are simply Shudras, then the social order will be disturbed. In spite of your state of Shudras, the Brahmanas are there. That is necessary. So, if you do not divide the social order in such a way that then it will be chaos. That is the scientific estimation of the Vedas. You may belong to the Shudra class, but to maintain the social order, you have to train some of the Shudras to become Brahmanas. It cannot depend on the Shudras. Prabhupada gave his standard analogy, comparing the social body to the human body. All the parts are necessary, not only the legs, but the belly, the arms, and the head. Otherwise, he said, it will not work properly. As long as this is going on, there will be some disturbance. Modern society's missing point, Prabhupada said, was an understanding of the purpose of human life. They do not know what is the next life, he said. There is no department of knowledge or scientific department to study what is there after finishing this body. Professor Kotovsky objected, politely, completely. Swamiji, he said, when the body dies, the owner also dies. Prabhupada marked his reply. No, Prabhupada quickly replied, this fact you must know. Why is there no department of knowledge in the university to study this fact scientifically? That is my proposition. That department is lacking. It may be as you say. It may be as I say, but there must be a department of knowledge. Now, recently, a cardiologist, a doctor in Montreal and Toronto, has accepted that there is a soul. I had some correspondence with him. He strongly believes that there is a soul. Prabhupada continued to build his argument. We accept knowledge from authority. The professor countered that everything had to be accepted on the basis of empirical evidence. But then, in mid-sentence, he stopped arguing and inquired, have you many branches of society in the world? Prabhupada began speaking about ISKCON with its 65 branches all around the world and of how he was going next to Paris, where his disciples had recently acquired a new center, and of how the American boys and girls, especially, were joining his movement. He told of the 4 prohibitive rules: no meat eating, no illicit sex, no intoxication. As Prabhupada described the workings of his movement, Professor Kotovsky nodded approvingly. When Prabhupada returned to comparing Krishna consciousness to communism, he concluded that the two philosophies were in agreement and both stressed surrender to an authority. The devotee surrenders to Krishna, the communist to Lenin. Prabhupada, our life is by surrender, is it not? Do you agree with this point? Kotovsky, to some extent you surrender. Prabhupada, yes, to the full extent. Kotovsky, you have to surrender to the society, for instance, the whole people. Prabhupada, yes, to the whole people, or to the state, or king, or government, or whatever you say. The surrender must be there. It may be difficult, it may be different. Kotovsky, the only difficulty is we cannot have surrender to government or to a king. The principal difference is of surrender to a king who is a single person or to the whole society. Prabhupada, no, that is a change of color only, but the surrender is there. The principle of surrender is there. Whether you surrender to monarchy, democracy, aristocracy, or dictatorship, you have to surrender. That is a fact. Without surrender, there is no life. It is not possible. So we are educating persons to surrender to the Supreme, wherefrom you get all protection, just like Krishna says, Sarva Dharman Parityajya. So surrender is there. No one can say, no, I am not surrendered to anyone. The difference is where he surrenders. And the ultimate surrendering object is Krishna. Therefore, in Bhagavad Gita, it is said, Bahunam Janmanamante Jnanavan Mam Prapadyate. After surrendering to so many things, birth after birth, when one is factually wise, he surrenders to me. Professor Kotovsky agreed. But surrender had to be accompanied by revolution, he said. The French Revolution, for example, was a revolt against one kind of surrender, and yet the revolution itself was another surrender to the people. So it is not enough to come full stop. The professor argued surrender is to be accompanied with revolt against surrender to other people. Prabhupada, yes, the surrender will be full stop When it is surrender to Krishna, that is full stop. No more surrender. Other surrender you have to change by revolution. But when you come to Krishna, then it is sufficient. You are satisfied. Just like I, I give you one example. A child is crying and people change laps. Oh, it has not stopped. But as soon as the baby comes to the lap of its mother, Potowski, it stops. Prabhupada, yes, full satisfaction. So the surrender, the changes will go on in different categories. The sum total of all these surrenders is surrender to material Maya, material illusion. But the final surrender is to Krishna, and then you will be happy.
Mataji, can you just pause there for a minute?
Yes, Prabhu.
Can you see me on the screen now?
Yes, Prabhu.
Okay, Hare Krishna. Yeah, so what I wanted to say was, if you notice here, how Prabhupada engages Professor Kotowski. He takes him along in the conversation, finding points of similarity, and then very patiently, carefully, Prabhupada explains to him what actually surrender means. Excellent. I mean, if you notice, he's not just cutting him off or fighting with him and nothing, actually. So he's very carefully, patiently engaging with him and trying to explain to him, this is classical Prabhupada, that classic Prabhupada, that he would take a person's argument and use that argument to make sense to them. Like here he's talking about a revolution also after surrender. And Prabhupada says, just like a child goes to the lap of the mother, that's it. So there's no need of anything else apart from that. So Prabhupada is bringing up the idea that the sum total of all the material surrender cannot give you that happiness and peace that you're looking for. Therefore, it is important that the surrender has to be in the right place, which means that it has to be surrender to God or surrender to Krishna. Only that can completely satisfy the heart. And anyway, we have to surrender. Our nature is to surrender. Prabhupada is making that point, that either you surrender to the people or the king or somebody, you have to surrender. So why not surrender to Krishna? Thank you, Mataji. So we'll go ahead.
Yes, Prabhu.
Okay. Okay. Can you just hold on? Yeah. I mean, we've read for a while now, and anybody has any thoughts or questions or reflections or anything to say at this point?
I was, as I was reading, I was just thinking that Prabhupada is really bold to say that he wants to come there and influence the people and give them Krishna in a country where they are, they consider religion itself as poison or whatever, But he doesn't mince his words. He's very clear about what he's trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, he's not referring to anyway. I mean, from what I read, what I heard, he's not referring to talking to the people in general, but I think to the group of teachers and scholars and things like that, right? In the university. Isn't that what we read?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Of course, he's not talking about the general public, but whatever it is, he wants to make the intelligent class of people think and understand.
Yeah, because he thinks once the leaders are aware, then it's just a matter of time before it would percolate further to the public.
Yes, that's correct. That's right. That's right.
Shall we continue?
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Yes, Prabhuji.
And usually Westerners accepting the fact of surrender or serving is something which they can't easily accept that. So they will not kind of try to follow a kind of a path which is, so they try to follow their own path. So surrendering, serving something which Westerners. So Prabhupada in that respect, Prabhupada is kind of really courageous enough to simply tell them the truth, irrespective of what they feel. So that is something which is exemplary of Prabhupada.
Yeah, also, I mean, in modern terms, what has happened is the word surrender has also got a very different connotation. Surrender gives a connotation of helplessness and some kind of it's got a negative connotation. But whenever Srila Prabhupada used that expression, he used it in a positive sense. Means you have to serve someone. Why not serve Krishna? That is the meaning of surrender, in the sense of serve that person who is worthy to be served. You know, that is what his concept is of surrender. I mean, especially in modern language, surrender is not a very popular word because it has a connotation. It's a very negative connotation. Of course, I mean, words will keep changing its meaning over time. So it's a duty of, I mean, all of us as followers of Srila Prabhupada explain what Prabhupada meant when he said surrender. Surrender means all of us have to serve someone. So why not serve that person by which we can get complete satisfaction? Yes, Mataji, please go ahead.
Yes, Prabhu.
Okay,
After only
if anyone else has something to say, I'm sorry. If anyone else has something to say, you can go ahead. Okay, you can go ahead, Mataji.
Yes, Prabhu. After only 3 days, Prabhupada's mission in Moscow seemed finished. The meeting with Professor Kotovsky over, what was left? The government would allow nothing else. It had not allowed him to bring in books, and now he had been refused the opportunity to speak publicly. Foreigners were not to talk with the Russians. He could go nowhere unless on an accompanied tour. So, with no preaching and no prospects, he stayed in his cramped room, taking his massage, bathing, accepting whatever food Shamsundar could gather and cook, dictating a few letters, chanting Hare Krishna, and translating Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada took a guided tour of Moscow, riding with other tourists on a crowded bus. He saw elderly Russians going to church, armed guards stationed at the door. He soon tired of the tour, however, and the tour guide got him a taxi and instructed the driver to return him to Hotel National. Shamsundar continued to spend most of his day looking for fresh food. Hearing that oranges were available at a certain market across town, he set out across the city. With his shaved head and his white dhoti and kurta, he drew stares from everyone he passed, and as he was returning after dark, uniformed men wearing red armbands accosted him, taking him to be a local deviant. Grabbing him, they pinned his arms behind his back and shouted at him in Russian. Shamsundar caught the words document, document, passport. He replied, document? Hotel, hotel. Realizing Shamsundar was a tourist, the officers released him and he returned to the hotel and informed Prabhupada of what had taken place. There is no hope in Russia without Krishna consciousness, Prabhupada said. Once Shamsundar was standing in line at the yogurt store when a man behind him asked him about yoga. I really want to talk with you, the man said, and he gave Shamsundar his name and address and a time they could safely meet. When Shamsundar told Prabhupada, Prabhupada said, no, he's a policeman, don't go. One day, 2 young men, one the son of an Indian diplomat stationed in Moscow, the other a young Muscovite, were loitering near Red Square when they saw an amazing sight. Out of the usual regimented routine of city traffic, a tall young man with a shaved head, a long reddish ponytail, and flowing white robes approached. It was Shamsundar. Familiar with Shamsundar's dress, the son of the Indian diplomat stopped him. Shamsundar smiled. Hare Krishna, brother. and he began talking with the Indian whose name was Narayan. The Russian, Ivan, knew a little English and followed the conversation as closely as he could. The talk grew serious. Why don't you come up and meet my spiritual master, Shamsundar asked. Honored, the boys immediately accompanied Shamsundar to the Hotel National. When they arrived, they found Prabhupada seated on his bed, aglow and smiling, Aravinda massaging his feet. Shamsundar entered, offering obeisances before Prabhupada. Ivan was completely fascinated. Come on, Prabhupada said, and the three of them sat at Prabhupada's feet. Turning first to Narayan, Prabhupada asked his name and his father's occupation. Narayan liked Prabhupada and offered to bring him green vegetables. His father, being highly placed at the Indian embassy, had produce flown in from India. Ivan was interested even more than his Indian friend, and Prabhupada began explaining to him the philosophy of Krishna consciousness while Narayan helped by translating. Ivan inquired with respect and awe, and Prabhupada answered his questions, teaching as much basic information about Krishna consciousness as was possible in one sitting. Prabhupada explained the difference between the spirit soul and the body and described the soul's eternal relationship with Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He spoke of Bhagavad Gita, of his network of temples around the world, and of his young men and women disciples, all practicing Bhakti Yoga. Prabhupada mentioned his desire to preach in Russia, which was a great field for Krishna consciousness because the people were open-minded and hadn't been polluted by sense gratification. He wanted to introduce Krishna conscious literature in Russia through a library or a reading room or in whatever way possible. Krishna conscious philosophy, he said, should be taught to Russia's most intelligent people, but because of government restrictions, it would have to be done discreetly. Devotees would not be able to sing and dance in the streets, but they could chant quietly together in someone's home. Prabhupada then began singing very quietly, leading the boys in kirtan. Ivan's taking to Krishna was like a hungry man eating a meal. After several hours, however, he and his friend had to go. They would return the next day. Shamsundar began spending time with Ivan and Narayan. Ivan, a student of Oriental philosophies, was very intelligent and eager to know what was going on in the outside world. He was fond of the Beatles, and Prabhupada told him of his association with George Harrison and John Lennon. Ivan and Shamsundar had long talks about the ambitions and hopes of young people outside Russia, and Shamsundar explained to him how Krishna consciousness was the topmost of all spiritual paths. Shamsundar also taught him basic principles of Bhakti Yoga, such as chanting the prescribed 16 rounds of japa daily, and gave him his own copy of Bhagavad Gita as it is. Prabhupada showed Ivan how to prepare chapatis and rice and asked him to give up eating meat. Joyfully, Ivan accepted the chanting, the new way of eating, everything. Ivan was being trained so that after Prabhupada left, Ivan could continue on his own. Ivan would be able to feel himself changing and advancing in spiritual life, and after practicing for some time, he could be initiated. Ivan said he would tell his friends about Krishna consciousness. With only 2 days left in Moscow, Prabhupada taught Ivan as much as he could. In this young Russian's eagerness and intelligence, Prabhupada found the real purpose of his visit to Russia. Prabhupada gave the analogy that when cooking rice, the cook need to test only one grain to determine whether the whole pot of rice is done. Similarly, by talking with this one Russian youth, Prabhupada could tell that the Russian people were not satisfied in their so-called ideal land of Marxism. Just as Ivan was keenly receptive to Krishna consciousness, millions of other Russians would be also. Chanakya Pandit says that one blooming flower can refresh a whole forest, and that a fire in a single tree can burn the whole forest. From the Marxist point of view, Ivan was the fire that would spread Krishna consciousness to others thus defeating the communist ideology. And from Prabhupada's point of view, he was the aromatic flower that would lend its fragrance to many others. Prabhupada's visit to Russia was no obscure interlude, but had become an occasion for planting the seed of Krishna consciousness in a destitute land. Srila Prabhupada had brought the movement of Lord Caitanya to yet another country. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself had predicted that the Sankirtan movement would go to every town and village, yet for hundreds of years that prediction had remained unfulfilled. Prabhupada, however, in the few years since his first trip to America in 1965, had again and again planted Lord Chaitanya's message in one unlikely place after another. And of all places, this was perhaps the most unlikely. During a brief government-supervised visit to Moscow, he had planted the seed of Krishna consciousness within the Soviet Union. He was like a needle, and everyone, everything connected with him was like the thread that would follow. Professor Kotovsky had remarked that Prabhupada's stay in an old-fashioned hotel would not prove very interesting, but Prabhupada, unknown to Professor Kotovsky, was transcendental to Moscow or any other place in the material world. Prabhupada had come to this place, and Krishna had sent a sincere soul to him to receive the gift of Krishna consciousness. This had happened not by devious espionage against the Soviet government, but by the presence of Krishna's pure devotee and his natural desire to satisfy Krishna by preaching. In response to Prabhupada's pure desire, Krishna had sent one boy, and from that one boy, the desire would spread to others. Nothing, not even an iron curtain, could stop Krishna consciousness. The soul's natural function was to serve Krishna, and Krishna's natural will was to satisfy the pure desires of his devotees. In a farewell letter to Professor Kotovsky, Prabhupada tried to encourage further correspondence. You wanted to see the manuscripts of my lectures, therefore I am sending herewith an introduction to the lectures, and if you so desire, I shall be glad to send essays on these subjects. Number 1, Vedic conceptions of socialism and communism. Number 2, scientific values of classless society. Number 3, knowledge by authoritative tradition. In a letter to Tamal Krishna, Prabhupada summed up his Moscow visit. The city is well planned. There are big houses and roads, and at daytime the streets are busy with buses, cars, and underground trains, which are far better than American or English. The underground streets are very neat and clean. The surface streets are also daily washed, but there is some difficulty in collecting vegetarian foodstuffs. Still, we are cooking our meals by the cooker, which has saved our lives. We talked with one big professor, Mr. Kotovsky, and Shamsundar talked with many great writers and musicians. 2 boys are working with us, one Indian and one Russian. So there is good prospect for opening a center, although the atmosphere is not very good. The embassy was no help. So our visit to Moscow was not so successful, but for the future, it is hopeful. Tomorrow, I go to Paris for one day, then to SF Pratyatra, and then I shall come back to London. Paris, June 25, 1971. Srila Prabhupada was lying on the couch room of the Indian Tourist Office. Having just come from Orly Airport, 2 disciples, Aradhana and his wife Shantanu, had come with him in the taxi and were the only others in the room. Since there was to be a press conference later, Prabhupada said he wanted to rest and he closed his eyes. At the airport, Paris immigration officials had detained Prabhupada. 30 European devotees, none of whom he had ever met, had waited anxiously. Just 1 minute, Prabhu. Hare Krishna, am I audible?
Yes, Mataji.
Okay. Yeah, at the airport, Paris immigration officials had detained Prabhupada while some 30 European devotees, none of whom had ever met him, had waited anxiously. They had glimpsed him as he had walked from the plane to the terminal building, and they had watched him carrying his sannyas danda with umbrella strapped to it. He had waved to them, holding up his bead bag, but then he had been kept from them just beyond a thin wall until finally, after 2 hours, Paris immigration had allowed him through. The Paris devotees had not arranged a car for Prabhupada, so when he asked for one, several devotees had run off to hail a taxi. When the taxi arrived, Prabhupada, along with Aradhana and Shantanu, had started for the Indian Tourist Office, leaving the others to join him later. After a brief rest, Prabhupada opened his eyes and saw Aradhana, Shantanu, and Shamsundar in the room. The other devotees and the press would be arriving soon. As Prabhupada sat up, Shantanu offered him some mango, and Srila Prabhupada smiled. Yogeshwara, I sat outside the door to Prabhupada's room, eating the peel of the mango Prabhupada had eaten. My heart was pounding, and I had no idea what it was going to be like after having been initiated for a year and a half and having never met my spiritual master personally. But not knowing that he was just behind that door. But now knowing that he was just behind that door. Then Shamsundar opened the door and peered out and saw me sitting there. He struck his head back inside the door and said, There is a devotee here. Shall I let him in now, Srila Prabhupada? I peeked around the door, and Srila Prabhupada, who had been lying down on the couch, was now sitting up with his hand on his knee, very solidly, with a royal, majestic look. He responded to Shamsundar's question by motioning with his hand that we could all come in. It was the first perfect thing I had ever seen in my life, that one gesture. So I came in and immediately fell flat on the floor. And then I understood that now I am with my spiritual master. Gradually, the devotees began arriving from the airport and they came into Prabhupada's room. The press also arrived. As Prabhupada spoke warmly and pleasantly with his followers, encouraging them in their preaching and telling them of his own recent preaching in Moscow. Hardly any of the devotees had ever been with their spiritual master before, and Lochanananda began introducing them to Srila Prabhupada. Hari Vilas. I arrived late, and when I came in, I was mixed up with surprise, with elation, with egotistical pride, and with amazement that the Lord's pure devotee was there. I walked in with Ghanashyam, the boy who had started translating some of Prabhupada's books into French. The room was almost filled, and Ghanashyam immediately sat down in the back. I was the president of the temple, and I was very proud and puffed up about it. So I made my way all the way up to the front, where Srila Prabhupada was, and I sat down right next to him. I looked at him, expecting him to look at me and smile or something, some recognition, but he didn't look at me at all. Lochanananda was introducing all the devotees to Prabhupada. Lochanananda said, This is Ghanashyam. He is the translator. Prabhupada said, Where is he? And everyone looked around to Ghanashyam in the back. Prabhupada said, Let him stand up, please. Ghanashyam stood, and Prabhupada looked at him and smiled and said, Okay, thank you very much. Right then.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, oh, thank you very much. Right then, I felt a little funny. I sat there wondering, what have I done? I have walked all the way up to the front and I'm expecting so much recognition. Then Lochananda said, This is Hari Vilas. He's the president of the temple. Prabhupada didn't even look at me. And I knew, yes, I had made a big mistake. I began to realize, this is my spiritual master, because immediately he had acted in such a way as to point out a great fault in me. Reporters began their questioning, and Prabhupada patiently answered them, taking advantage of their sometimes superficial questions to elaborate on the philosophy of Krishna consciousness
and explain the Krishna consciousness movement. The conference ran 1 hour. As Prabhupada left the Indian tourist office, he found that there was no car to take him to the temple, while several devotees ran around trying to find a taxi. Prabhupada waited, standing before a sidewalk cafe. Thinking that Prabhupada must be tired from the rigorous press conference and his long flight from Moscow, one of the devotees asked, Srila Prabhupada, would you like to sit here for a minute? And the devotee pulled one of the cafe chairs out away from its table. What is this place? Prabhupada asked. This is a sidewalk cafe, the devotee replied. What do people do here? Do they smoke and drink? Yes, Srila Prabhupada, it's a cafe. They serve alcoholic beverages. No, Prabhupada replied. Guru cannot sit in such a place. When Prabhupada reached the temple, he bathed and took prasadam. The next day, he was scheduled to leave for Los Angeles, and his one day in Paris was filled with outside engagements. He rested and again went out to preach. The devotees had rented the Olympia Theatre, a large auditorium meant to seat more than 2,000. But because the devotees had advertised Prabhupada's lecture only 2 days in advance, only 40 people attended. Prabhupada was undaunted and he lectured and held kirtan. Afterward, he went to a television studio for an interview. By the time Prabhupada returned to the temple, it was 1 in the morning. Shyam Sundar told the devotees who had all accompanied Prabhupada during the day that they should rest a full 6 hours before rising. But the next morning, Prabhupada rose as usual, and at 5 o'clock, he was demanding to know why there was no Mangalarti. He sent his servant to wake the devotees, and as the devotees were hurrying to the temple room, he began their morning worship. Prabhupada was going out on his morning walk. Accompanying Prabhupada on this walk were Shyam Sundar, Aravinda, and the Paris temple president, Harivilas. The spring morning was sunny, and Prabhupada, walking with his cane, appeared noble. Shyam Sundar, Prabhupada asked, why are all the householders in Maya? And Shyam Sundar couldn't reply. Prabhupada said, that's all right. That is their position, to be in Maya. He said that when he had gone to America, his plans had been to make sannyasis. But when he saw the free mixing of the sexes in the West, he had decided to let his disciples first get married and have a child. And then the wife could go to Vrindavan with the child, and the husband could take sannyas. Prabhupada laughed. Man becomes entangled by his family, he said, by his home, his bank account, his animals, and so many other attachments. Near the end of his walk, Prabhupada spoke specifically of Paris. 3 things are prominent here, he said, wine, women, and money. What do you think, Harivilas? Is this a fact? Harivilas replied, yes, Prabhupada, this is definitely a fact, wine, women, and money. Prabhupada said that although these attachments were very strong, the Krishna consciousness movement would overcome their influence. Prabhupada said that the houses in the Paris suburb with their attractive fenced-in yards were excellent, but everything was being wasted for sense gratification. Although a French gentleman may have such a first-class house, garden, wife, bank account, and car, he has no spiritual knowledge. Therefore, he would always remain attached to his first-class possessions, and at the end of his life, his great attachment would lead him to take birth as a cockroach or rat or dog within that same house. As Prabhupada and the devotees continued walking, Prabhupada asked Harivilas how he thought the temple's preaching was faring. Harivilas said he thought it would be successful, but that it might be a good idea to make extra income by starting a business. Your business is preaching, Prabhupada said. If there are some householders, they can do business. When Prabhupada and his party arrived at the temple, they found the devotees eagerly waiting for Prabhupada's morning Bhagavatam lecture. But there was no time. Prabhupada had to leave at once for the airport. He was returning to America. So the chapter ends.
Okay, any thoughts, questions, reflections? One thing that I wanted to say how Harivilas Prabhu mentions, Prabhupada knew perfectly how to relate with everyone. He could cut through any pretense or anything which was negative or inappropriate. He could chop it down. That's the definition of a sadhu. Sadhu means one who can chop down all illusions and all the attachments and all that. So we take shelter of the sadhu for that. We don't take shelter of the sadhu to increase our sense of material identity, or we take shelter of the sadhus, so they make us attached to Krishna and chop off at our material sense of identification and the material sense of fulfillment and the satisfaction and the greatness and the whatever that we may hanker for. Any other thoughts, questions, reflections?
Prabhu, okay, coming back to the point of surrender, which you mentioned earlier, surrender, which we have to understand, is that that anukulyasya sankalpam, pratikulyasya varjanam, rakshasyatiti.
Surrender means 6 elements. Surrender
That's
means
6 elements. Exactly. This anukulyasya, that is doing something favorable to the Lord and rejecting those. So that is the one, right? The right meaning for
accepting things favorable, rejecting things unfavorable, to be firmly dependent on the mercy of the Lord, to be fully dependent on the mercy of the Lord, to have firm faith in the protection of the Lord, to feel exclusively dependent. Hold on. Accepting is favorable, rejecting is unfavorable, to firmly believe in the Lord's protection, to be exclusively dependent on the mercy of the Lord, to have no interest separate from the interests of the Lord, and to always feel meek and humble.
Okay. So is there a point to give up the pride of having surrender, Prabhu? No.
What do you mean pride of surrender?
When some will have the pride that they are completely surrendered, so that pride also should not be there.
I mean, that it's an oxymoron. Those who surrender will not have pride, no?
Oh, surely they'll have pride, Prabhu.
They will not. How will they have?
That means they are not surrendered, actually, right?
Yeah, because one of the elements of surrender is to be meek and humble. No. That is one of the elements, to always feel meek and humble. See, the idea is that, first of all, a devotee feels very grateful for what the Lord has given and done for him or her. Okay? Because the moment we feel grateful for what somebody, send this to me from Radhanath Swami, that suppose somebody feels very grateful for what the Lord has given and done, then one feels that one is not deserving of it. So gratefulness leads to humility. You understood, right? So this is one of the elements of surrender is humility, or to always feel meek and humble. Because one thinks that what the Lord has done to him is what he does not, he is far more than what he deserves. So one feels very meek and humble.
Fine, Prabhu.
Any other thoughts, reflections? Okay, Mataji, you can go ahead. We'll read for another 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes maybe.
Chapter 35. This remote corner of the world. Although Srila Prabhupada had been away from America for a year, his Krishna consciousness movement had flourished by Krishna's grace, and the devotees' attachment for him had grown. His disciples, having heard reports and seen photos of his triumphant tour of India, had felt inspired to increase their own preaching. In each American center, new devotees had been joining and were learning Prabhupada's teachings from the senior devotees. Already accepting Srila Prabhupada as their spiritual master, hundreds of newcomers were eagerly awaiting initiation. How different from Prabhupada's first arrival in America alone in 1965. Walking the cold streets with no money and no temple, he had been ignored. Sometimes he had thought of quitting, taking a boat back to India, but he had maintained absolute faith. And now, less than 6 years later, in dozens of ISKCON centers throughout America, hundreds of disciples worshipped him and would throng ecstatically to receive him. Los Angeles, June 26, 1971. When Prabhupada had left Los Angeles a year ago, the political turmoil there had troubled his mind, but on returning, he found the devotees recovered. Faithfully, they were executing his orders to chant publicly, distribute Back to Godhead magazine, and worship the deity of Rukmini Dwarakadisha. In the gorgeously decorated Los Angeles temple, Prabhupada performed a large initiation ceremony, accepting dozens of new disciples. On June 27th, Srila Prabhupada traveled from Los Angeles to San Francisco for the 5th annual Rath Yatra. 200 followers met him at the airport. How many devotees do you have? A reporter asked. Unlimited, Prabhupada said. Some admit and some don't admit. Admit you are a servant of Lord Krishna and your life will be a success. After 2 days in San Francisco, Prabhupada returned to Los Angeles and on July 16 flew to Detroit. Bhagavan Das, Prabhupada's governing body secretary for the Midwest, had preached vigorously in his zone, opening centers in St. Louis, Chicago, and other cities. Almost 300 devotees, most of whom had never seen Prabhupada, assembled at the Detroit airport to receive him. Sureshwar. Devotees had come from all over the Midwestern US and Eastern Canada to greet Srila Prabhupada at Detroit's Metro Airport. The red and gold throne stood in the center of the reception room, and the devotees were chanting Hare Krishna and dancing, awaiting Prabhupada's arrival. When the plane finally landed, all bliss broke loose. The disembarkation dolly joined the plane, but we couldn't see Srila Prabhupada. I became anxious. When would he enter the room? Suddenly, a cry went up, and I looked around. Devotees were bowing down. Gurukrama. Srila Prabhupada entered the room as bright as the sun, and everyone immediately prostrated themselves on the floor. Not like the other times when we bowed down together, but this was like an overwhelming force hit us, and we were being thrown to our knees. When I stood up, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was Prabhupada. Almost everyone in the room was crying. Indrajumna. My first glimpse of Prabhupada was through the lens of my camera, and I thought he looked just like he did in his pictures. I had only seen him in pictures, and now he looked just like the pictures, only moving. All the devotees began to cry and fall to the ground. It was a transcendental, emotional thing. I was watching all the older devotees, how much love they had for Srila Prabhupada, and I was feeling unqualified and sinful. Urukrama. Prabhupada appeared powerful, yet at the same time delicate and soft, like a very wonderful flower. As he moved along very slowly, the devotees lined up and made an aisle for him to walk. He walked up to Kirtananda Maharaj, put a garland around him, and embraced him. Kirtananda Maharaj was crying tears of ecstasy, and he looked like a little boy next to his father. Then Prabhupada went to Bhagavan and patted him on the head. Then he embraced Bhagavan, who had begun to weep like a little boy who has just seen his father after a very long time. Vishwakarma. I arrived late. When I got there, I was afraid to look at Srila Prabhupada because I felt too fallen to look upon the pure representative of the Lord. So I stayed behind a wall of devotees, afraid to look. Finally, I realized this is ridiculous, as the perfection of the eyes is to behold the form of Krishna's pure devotee. I raised my head and I saw him sitting on his Vyasasana, drinking a cup of water. Never had I seen anyone drink water like that without touching the goblet to their mouth. The water poured from the cup like a shining silver stream straight into Prabhupada's mouth and throat, and he finished the water in a few swallows. He appeared to be a grand sage from the spiritual realm, and as everyone chanted, he looked around at the devotees, smiling with great pleasure. Everyone was overwhelmed with transcendental joy, and I joined with over half the devotees in weeping. Prabhupada began speaking. This is very satisfactory that so many devotees, boys and girls, are taking part in this great movement, Krishna consciousness movement. It is a very important movement because it is correcting the human civilization. It is a great effect in the modern civilization. People are accepting this body as self. And based on this mistake in the foundation, everything is going wrong. Accepting this body as the self is the beginning of all problems. The great philosophers, scientists, theologians, and thoughtful men do not know what is the defect. Recently, I was in Moscow, so I had a nice talk with a professor of Indology, Professor Kotovsky. He was speaking that, Swamiji, after this annihilation of this body, everything is finished. So I was astonished that a learned professor, posing himself in a very responsible pose, had no idea about the soul and the body, how they are different, how the soul is migrating from one body to another. As Prabhupada spoke, a voice announced over the public address system that the departure lounge had to be cleared for the next flight. They're speaking about ourselves, Prabhupada asked. We shall stop? All right, let us go. That evening, in the temple room of Detroit's ISKCON Center, Srila Prabhupada sat on his Vyasasana before the deities of Lord Jagannath, Subhadra, and Balaram. While a devotee led the kirtan, Prabhupada played his kartals, looking around the room at his disciples. He was nodding his head, pleased to see them dancing and chanting. After the kirtan, he lectured. Just see how their characters are being formed, how they are becoming purified, how their faces are becoming brighter. It is practical. So our request is take full advantage of the center. You come here. It is being guided by one of my best disciples, Bhagavan Das. So he and others will help you. Please come regularly to this temple and take advantage of it. After his lecture, Prabhupada asked for questions. Bahulashva raised his hand. Srila Prabhupada, what is the thing that will please you the most? Chant Hare Krishna, Prabhupada replied, and the devotees spontaneously cried out, Jai, Jai. Prabhupada, that is the simplest things. You are chanting, I am very much pleased, that's all. I came to your country to chant that you would chant also along with me. You are helping me by chanting, so I'm pleased. But this tendency is very nice that you want to please me. That is very good. And to please me is not very difficult. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said that under my order, every one of you go preach and become spiritual master. And what is that order? The order is whomever you meet, talk to him about Krishna. Prabhupada emphasized that if one wanted to preach and represent Krishna, then he could not change the message of Krishna, but must repeat what Krishna says. I have come here for the first time, Prabhupada continued, but before me, Bhagavan Das, he has organized. And what is his credit? He has presented things as I told him. That's all. This is wonderful. In Los Angeles also, a program is going on very nicely. My disciple in charge there is Karandhara. He is present there. He's simply doing what I instruct, and he's doing very nicely, first class. Everyone who comes, they come.
Mataji, can we stop there for a minute? So
Yes,
here, one sec. So Prabhupada is emphasizing Prabhupada is making this point. I have come here for the first time, Prabhupada continued, but before me, Bhagavan Das, he has organized. And what is his credit? He has presented things as I told him, that's all. This is wonderful. In Los Angeles also, a program is going on very nicely. My disciple in charge there is Karandar. He's present here. He's simply doing what I instruct, and he's doing very nicely, first class. Everyone who comes, they come and are enchanted by the temple with the activities with the disciples. So this is the way. This is called Parampara system. Don't concoct. So we notice here that Prabhupada's Bhakti Shakti flows through his serious followers. Anyone who does not concoct and tries to do exactly as Prabhupada did and say exactly what he said, then they transmit that Bhakti Shakti. So Prabhupada himself is talking about it here. We see he's talking about Bhagavan, he's talking also about Karandara. Because they did not concoct, they transmit it as it is, it has potency. And because it has potency, it is making devotees. Yeah. Please go ahead, Nathan.
Yes, Prabhu. As Prabhupada was leaving the temple that evening, the mother of one of his disciples approached him. You know, she said, these boys actually worship you. Yes, Prabhupada said, that is our system. I'm also worshipping my Guru Maharaj. The devotees around Prabhupada looked at one another and smiled. Although the woman had tried to make it appear extraordinary that Prabhupada's disciples worshipped him, Prabhupada had taken it casually. One must worship the Guru. It was the Vaishnava standard and nothing to wonder at.
Okay, we'll stop there for this Sunday. Next Sunday is the, I think it's the 2nd. Yeah, there is the Vyasa Puja of His Holiness Jayapataka Maharaj, who is my spiritual master. I don't think it may spill over to the 2nd, but if it does, then we won't have a class, but most likely it won't spill over to the 2nd. So the next class is scheduled for next Sunday. However, we are closing here at this particular juncture because next section there are 3 in the book. You have 3 stars, which means that it's end of a section. So any thoughts, questions, reflections about anything that we spoke today? Because our format is 1.5 hours of class and half an hour of question. So sometimes, generally we don't begin exactly on time, waiting for everyone to join. So we extend it usually by about 10 minutes also. So it's 5:10 now, Indian Standard Time.
Yes,
Roji, I was waiting to hear your voice.
A couple of questions, Prabhuji. Firstly, do we know who those 2 devotees were in Moscow, the Indian devotee and the Russian devotee? Do we have trace of who they are now?
Russian devotees, I think he was initiated as Ananta Shakti Prabhu, who left his body, and there is a samadhi for him in the Goshala in ISKCON Vrindavan.
So that was the Russian body devotee, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, and there was an Indian body devotee.
I don't know if he became a devotee or not. Whether Narayan became a devotee, I don't know.
Okay. I've had to travel a lot to Russia for work as well, and it is, as Prabhupada and devotees found, very, very difficult to survive and find something to eat there. It is very difficult. We just read about Bhagavan Das. Is this the Bhagavan that fell later?
Yeah, the Bhagavan.
So Prabhupada here describes him as one of his best devotees, his best disciples. And you just described also how the transmission of the words is in Parampara. Even with Prabhupada's own descriptions of such a disciple, how do you think the disparity of that disciple then falling away so dramatically lies in our thoughts?
See, also, Prabhupada called Harikesh Swami during his physical presence as the greatest grandson of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He also fell away. So, I mean, since you asked the question, 2 days ago, was it 2 days ago? Yeah, I think 2 days ago, Rameshwar Prabhu, we had the honor of hosting Rameshwar Prabhu for Prasadam at home in Mayapur. So he was talking about the era, post-Prabhupada era, where those selected by Prabhupada began to initiate. So he was saying that it was banned to think that the spiritual masters are anything other than Uttamadhikaris. So he was saying that he wrote some papers stating how he said that I knew who I was, so I wrote some papers stating that the gurus are not necessarily Uttamadhikaris, but he said he did research, he researched Prabhupada's books and came up with a thing that Madhyamadhikaris can also be gurus. But the moment he said that, he said there was an emergency meeting, not just for that, for other things also. And one of the things that was told to him is, either you correct and write a corrected paper, or we're going to excommunicate you from ISKCON. So then he said, give me a few hours. So he said he was just chanting and praying to Prabhupada. And at that time, the letter which Prabhupada wrote to him, I think the letter after the marathon, where they, impossible is, I mean, if I recollect it right, is after the marathon. Anyway, a very important letter that Prabhupada wrote him. He ends the letter by saying, the highest principle is to save oneself. Anyway, what is the point? No, sorry. In the letter, he says that, I mean, he says this also, but he also says, do not at any time get distracted from printing and publishing my books and things like that. So he said, okay, whatever it takes, I'll just go along with it, and I'll just print and publish books. So then he went ahead and printed. I mean, he continued in ISKCON. He said, okay, I'll write a different paper. And then he said, I mean, this is another funny thing. He said he wrote a paper picking out only the most choicest, most confidential kind of things, like Nikunja, Ratikeli Siddhahi, and all those kind of things. He thought that if he produces such an outlandish paper, it would be rejected by the others. But somehow some of them really liked that paper. Anyway, so he was just telling some humorous stories of the past. Sad also, but yeah. So for me, whenever I read any of these things, I take them as at that point in time. It's not a certification for eternity. For eternity, you have to work for it. But at that point in time, you are the best disciple of Prabhupada. Yes, that is a certification at that point in time. Just like you have companies, you need to get recertified every year, right? So until one attains love of Godhead, one has to keep on getting recertified. That's my understanding.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Any other thoughts, questions? Any corrections if I've said something wrong? Okay, so we'll end today's session. By default, we're going to have the next session, unless due to some Vyas Puja spillover or something, if there is something which comes up. But otherwise, by default, we're going to have the class on the 2nd of April, Sunday. This class is scheduled for the next. Okay, thank you all very much.
I have only one or two questions, Prabhu, but I'll ask next week because my throat is gone today.
Oh, okay,
So,
okay.
Yes, Prabhu, I'll ask next week, Prabhuji.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, okay.
Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripasindhubhyo cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavyo namo namah. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Gaura Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Nitai Gaura Premanande.